Hi everyone. I hope this video recording finds you all well. It's been a while, and I suppose it's good to be talking to you again. So, welcome to our S6 philosophy class. We continue our discussions, and today we're going to deal with the topic of historicity. In the earlier parts of the 20th century until, you know, mid 20th century, people were developing ideas about historicity or the idea that the human being is a historical being. By the way, this has roots in other intellectual movements like Romanticism, um, the growth of a discipline called philology, the study of ancient texts and languages, as well as other philosophical movements like phenomenology, which we briefly talked about before, and existentialism. So, by existentialism, I mean philosophies linked to Jean-Paul Sartre, Martin Heidegger, Gabriel Marcel. Some of these people, a couple of these people, we've already talked about. So, just to make sure that we're all, on the same page, remember the things that we've talked about until this point. So, you have the French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre talking about human existence, what it meant to exist in the world in our contemporary age, and then he says in the end that the human being is absolutely free. Now, of course, can there are many questions that we could raise about that. Are we really actually absolutely free? What does that mean? Is it true that we can just do whatever we want? And in a way, the philosopher we talked about after Sartre already gives an answer to that. Uh, Remember that we talked about Gabriel Marcel, and he says we should move from primary to secondary reflection. Primary reflection being more analytical, being closer to the kind of thinking that you have in the sciences, where you have an object before you. You're not really personally involved in this kind of thinking in the sense that you remain separate as an investigator from your object. But then Marcel says that we have to move into secondary reflection where we realize that first we are involved in this reflection, we are involved in, we have some links to the matter that we are trying to understand. It's not a problem, that we need to solve, but a mystery, a kind of mystery that involves us that we need to reflect on. And in the in our discussions, we focused on what Marcel had to say about embodiment. What does it mean to have a body and to be a body? Okay, so we looked at two different ways of relating to the body, which is possession and then identification. And we also saw the limits of those two approaches. But the thing is, the point is, in the end, we are, according to Marcel, embodied spirits. We are, the way we exist in the world is, as people, as as people who are embodied, that there's no other way for us to interact with the world and other people but by way of the body. So in a way, that's already a response to Sartre. Sartre say we're absolutely free, but given that we are embodied, so there must be some structure to the freedom, some limits to the freedom that we have as existence in the world. Now, at the same time, talking about limits, talking about realizing that our existence, our freedom are not absolute. We also turn to Levinas, a Lithuanian-born French philosopher, who reminded us in his descriptions of the experience of seeing the other person as face, that this experience makes us realize once again that we're not isolated human beings. We are not we're not only totalities that simply reduce others to ourselves. When we have that experience of the epiphany or the self showing of the other human being as face, then we are reminded of a certain reality that we cannot really reduce to ourselves, that we cannot simply manipulate or exploit. So the same experience of seeing the face awakens us once again, reminds us of our being responsible, of our responsibility. Now, as you will see, these different elements come together in the topic of historicity. Now, before I get into the discussion proper, before we really get into historicity, we can step back, stop for a moment and reflect upon a few scenarios. We could ask ourselves, are these things, these situations, these scenarios, were they inevitable? Are they inevitable? Were they meant to be? The Nazis losing to the Allies in World War II, for instance, was that meant to be? Okay. This is the saddest picture I could find on the internet. Saddest picture of Hitler. Or, I don't know if you've seen the series Game of Thrones, and I won't spoil it for you, but is Ned Stark's fate, the main protagonist in the earlier parts of the show, was that meant to be? Because if you've seen the first season, if you watch the first season, for instance, this happened to me, you would realize that there were indications, there were hints of the things that were going to happen in later episodes. So, for instance, here you have a dead female direwolf that apparently fought with the deer, and then apparently the direwolf was pregnant, and they found that the puppies, the wolf pups, were still alive, and they got them and took them in and raised them themselves. I mean, Ned Stark's family, okay, Ned Stark's sons and daughters. Now, the eventual fate of Ned Stark, was that meant to be? Was that fated? Or imagine a scenario where you end up being a homeless person and alone. If you are in that situation, you know, or if you see somebody in that situation, you could ask the question, is that meant to be? Was that always meant to be? Were you meant to end up being homeless, having nothing, living on the streets? Were there indications in the past that you would end up that way? Are the things that happen to us meant to be? Are they fated? These are questions that, you know, also lead us to other questions about history and the way our lives go. Are things meant to be the way they are? The short answer given us by this text, Historicity, written by a Belgian philosopher named Albert Dondeyne. So you're supposed to read this text. Here's Albert Dondeyne. As you can see, he was a priest, quite influential as well, influenced other Belgian thinkers and intellectuals. So the short answer is no. Dondeyne tells us, and this is inspired by some of the great philosophers like Heidegger, Gadamer, Dilthey, and many others. No, man is a historical being. What does that mean? Of we can approach this in a negative way. We can contrast ourselves to animals. Um, Dundee tells us, for instance, that animals they have no turning points. There are no turning points in their lives, at least no conscious turning points. Things happen to them, but animals cannot turn things around. Maybe they can for themselves and their immediate kin, in the sense of the other animals in their a family that they protect, that they help survive. That's it. That's about it. But in terms of consciously, in terms of deliberately making decisions, engaging in actions that would change things for them, I don't think we can speak of animals in this manner, or animal actions in this manner. They're also the objects of natural sciences. Why? Because they follow certain patterns. First of all, they are their behavior is instinctual. They follow certain patterns that seem to be hardwired in their brains, and so we can study them. Their The way they act, the way they move, what they do in particular situations. These things are predictable behavior. So animals are the objects of the sciences in this way, because the sciences try to predict behavior, try to predict future outcomes. Okay, but of course, then the implication is that we're not totally like this. There's something to the human being that makes the human being different from animals. We are historical beings. What does that mean? Being a historical being. That means that, let me just put it this way before I go into this slide here. That means that, in contrast to animals, history doesn't have only happen to us. You know, doesn't merely happen to us. The Dondeyne's point is that we have to realize that we ourselves make history happen. It's not as though we're passive experiencers of history. We are makers of history. Okay, that's the main point. That's the main thesis in this text. In the following recordings, we'll delve deeper into this claim. Of course, we still have to treat this as a kind of hypothesis, as a claim that uh, we can argue about, that can be true or false. So we're going to look at our own experiences, our what Dondeyne calls pre-philosophical experiences, in order for us to understand what this actually means to be a historical being. Okay, so I'll see you in the next recording.